In 416 BC, Athens taught the world a lesson about power that Wall Street still uses today. You watched him take it. The promotion, the Standard Oil fortune, the Microsoft monopoly. You watched the man who cuts corners, who bends rules, who says what people want to hear. You watched him take what you earned, and you did nothing, because you're better than that. This is what Thucydides called political realism, what modern investors call strategic positioning. The recognition that power flows to those who control bottlenecks, not to those who deserve them. You felt it in your chest, that tightening, that heat behind your eyes. You told yourself it was righteous anger. It wasn't. It was the feeling of an employee being executed by his own principles while equity holders collect. This is a psychological execution, and you're both the victim and the executioner. Not lazy, not stupid, not unlucky, predictable. Your hesitation, your fairness, your belief that regulatory compliance applies equally to everyone. These aren't virtues. They're the blade you handed to the people cutting your throat. Every time you wait for permission, someone seizes the bottleneck. Every time you play fair with people who wrote the rules through regulatory arbitrage, you lose before the game begins. Every time you hesitate because it wouldn't be right, you hand leverage to someone who never asked that question. The question isn't how do I get rich? Wrong frame. The real question is darker. Why am I still an employee instead of an equity holder? Let's dismantle the lie. In 416 BC, the Athenian navy arrived at the island of Melos. The Melians were neutral. They hadn't attacked Athens, hadn't allied with Sparta, hadn't done anything except exist in a location Athens wanted to control through the Delian League. The Athenians didn't come to negotiate. They came to deliver a lesson that has echoed through 24 centuries, a lesson taught in every political realism course that you still haven't learned. The historian Thucydides recorded what happened next in the Melian dialogue. The Athenian generals sat across from the Melian leaders and said something so brutal, so stripped of pretense, that it still reads like a slap across the face. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. No appeal to justice, no pretense of fairness. Just the naked architecture of power laid bare. But watch the first move carefully. The Athenians refused to address the Melian people. They insisted on private negotiations, no public assembly, no speeches to the masses. Why? Because the masses believe in morality. The crowds can be swayed by appeals to fairness, to justice, to divine punishment. The Athenians wanted none of that theater. They wanted to speak only to the leaders, the men who understood leverage but were too afraid to deploy it publicly. This is the first lesson: public virtue, private reality. The leaders of Melos knew they were outmatched. They knew Sparta wouldn't come. They knew the gods wouldn't intervene. But they couldn't admit this to their people, so they performed hope, while privately calculating surrender. The Athenians isolated their prey from the audience that might validate resistance. Then they dismantled every remaining pillar. Hope in Sparta? The Spartans calculate their interests through political realism. Saving you isn't in their interest. Hope in the gods? The gods favor the strong. That's why the strong are strong. Hope in justice? Justice is a negotiation between equals. You are not our equals. Therefore, justice doesn't apply. Power doesn't explain. Power acts. They called Melian hope misplaced, a comfort without tangible advantage. They dismissed divine favor as irrelevant when leverage was unequal. Justice only exists between equals. When power is asymmetric, morality is a story the weak tell themselves while they wait to be devoured. The Athenians weren't negotiating. They were performing a psychological execution, stripping the Melians of every belief that might fuel resistance before the physical execution began. The Melians clung to their idealism. They believed fairness would save them. They believed that because they had done nothing wrong could be done to them. 6 months later, Athens broke through the walls. Every Melian man was executed. Every woman and child was sold into slavery. The island was repopulated with Athenian colonists. The Melians died believing in a world that doesn't exist. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight. You are making the Melian mistake right now. You wait for permission. Others seize the bottleneck. You play by rules written by people who exempt themselves through regulatory arbitrage. You believe that if you work hard, stay honest, and wait your turn, the universe will reward your virtue with equity instead of keeping you an employee forever. It won't. The universe doesn't distribute rewards based on merit. It distributes them based on financial leverage. The Melians had morality. The Athenians had triremes. The triremes won. Your morality is the Melian delusion, the belief that fairness is a force in the world rather than a story told by employees. The world doesn't reward virtue. It rewards leverage. It rewards those who understand that power is the only reality. Everything else is negotiable. The Athenians weren't evil. They were honest. In any negotiation, the one with more leverage sets the terms. The one without leverage accepts them, or dies. If power is the only reality, then the question becomes, how did the architects of wealth master it without breaking the visible rules? How did they build empires while appearing pious, moral, and respectable? The Athenians were honest about their ruthlessness. The next empire was smarter. They built a cathedral over their sins. Medieval Europe had a problem. The Catholic Church declared usury, charging interest on loans, a mortal sin. Canon law had banned it since the 12th century. The penalty wasn't a fine. It was eternal damnation. Your soul burning forever because you charged a merchant 6%. But merchants needed credit. Trade required capital. The economy couldn't function without lending, so the architects of wealth faced a choice. Obey the moral law and remain small, or find a way to extract profit without appearing to break canon law through what we now call regulatory arbitrage. The House of Medici didn't break God's law. They engineered around it. Giovanni de' Medici founded his bank in Florence in 1397. His son Cosimo de' Medici expanded it into Europe's first holding company structure. Within decades, it became the most powerful financial institution in Europe, serving merchants, nobility, the Pope himself. They didn't achieve this by being more moral than their competitors. They achieved it by building a cathedral over the loophole so no one could see the hole. Here's how the regulatory arbitrage worked. A merchant in Florence needs 1,000 florins. He can't pay interest, that's a sin. So the Medici don't lend him money. Instead, they accept a deposit of 1,000 florins and issue a bill of exchange payable in London, in English pence, 6 months later. When the bill comes due, the exchange rate has fluctuated. The merchant repays the equivalent of 1,111 florins. The Medici have made 11% profit. But it's not interest, it's a currency exchange fee. The risk of fluctuation justifies the premium. Except the fluctuation wasn't random, using double-entry bookkeeping. An innovation they pioneered, the Medici controlled the exchange rates between their branches. Over 67 documented bills of exchange, they never lost money. Not once. 0 losses on 67 transactions. This wasn't luck. This was architecture. They called this hidden usury. Distinguished from the manifest usury of pawnbrokers who charged interest openly and faced fines of 2,000 florins annually. The Medici paid nothing. They had restructured sin into respectability through regulatory arbitrage. And then they went further. They didn't just hide their extraction. They made it holy. The Catholic Church itself became their client. The Medici collected papal tithes, the 10% tax on all Christian income, invested the funds using double-entry bookkeeping, and returned them with gifts rather than interest. They funded cathedrals, commissioned art, purchased doctrinal flexibility. But here's the social engineering most people miss. Under Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, they didn't just buy paintings. They bought the vibe of holiness. They funded Botticelli, Michelangelo, Brunelleschi. They bankrolled the Renaissance itself. Every chapel they commissioned, every fresco they funded, every cathedral they built, this wasn't charity. It was reputation laundering on a civilizational scale. They understood something you don't. Visibility is a liability unless it is curated as virtue. The House of Medici name became synonymous with beauty, culture, and piety. Who could accuse the patrons of the Sistine Chapel of usury? Who could condemn the family that made Florence the center of Western art? Their regulatory arbitrage was hidden behind a wall of masterpieces. This is the moral shield. They didn't avoid scrutiny. They made scrutiny feel ungrateful. This is the gatekeeper protocol in its purest form. The Medici didn't need to be right with God. They just needed to be the ones who paid the priest's salary. When canon law threatened their methods, they didn't argue theology. They funded the theologians. When dry exchange was banned as usury, papal influence mysteriously suspended the ban. The Medici had built a holding company structure the Pope couldn't touch, because the Pope was inside it. By the mid-15th century, the bank had 10 branches across Europe. They handled money for kings, cardinals, and the Vatican itself. They didn't just circumvent the rules. They became essential to the people who made the rules through regulatory arbitrage. This is regulatory arbitrage at its most elegant. They didn't fight the system. They made the system dependent on them. The lesson isn't that the Medici were wicked. The lesson is that moral constraints are for those without leverage. The rules bind employees who lack the architecture to transcend them into equity holder status. The pawnbroker who charged interest openly was fined, shamed, and damned. The House of Medici, who extracted the same profit through structural creativity, became bankers of popes and patrons of the Renaissance. Same extraction, different architecture, opposite outcomes. You follow the rules as they're written. They rewrite the rules to favor their holding company structure. You see a constraint and stop. They see a constraint and design regulatory arbitrage around it. The Athenians took by force. The Medici took by structure. Both understood the same iron law. Power flows to those who control the bottleneck. The Athenians controlled the sea. The Medici controlled access to capital. Your morality keeps you from seeing the bottleneck. Their architecture lets them own it. Here's the equation they never taught you. Wealth is not skill plus effort. Wealth is skill plus effort, multiplied by financial leverage. The multiplication sign is where fortunes are made, and employees are kept. You've been told that if you develop enough skill and apply enough effort, success will follow. This is the addition myth. The belief that you can stack enough hours, enough credentials, enough hustle to reach equity holder status. It's a lie. Addition has a ceiling. Financial leverage doesn't. Addition is for employees. Multiplication is for equity holders. Consider the hierarchy of leverage. At the bottom is the laborer, the employee. He trades time for money. 1 hour of work produces 1 hour of income. The ceiling is exhaustion. The maximum is death. No matter how skilled, no matter how hardworking, the laborer cannot escape the arithmetic of a finite body. He adds, hour after hour, until his body breaks. Above the laborer is the merchant. He trades goods instead of time. There's markup, there's scale. But the merchant is still bound to transactions. More sales require more effort. Above the merchant is the architect. He designs systems that others operate. The income scales beyond personal effort, but the architect still needs to maintain, to adjust, to manage. At the top is the equity holder. He owns the structure itself. The income flows whether or not he is present. The system works while he sleeps, while he travels, while he does nothing at all. Even in a coma, the equity compounds through financial leverage. Your morality keeps you in the employee tier. Work hard. Be honest. Wait your turn. This is the programming that ensures you never jump levels. You add hours while they multiply systems through financial leverage. You trade time while they trade equity. You exhaust yourself climbing a ladder that leads to someone else's roof. Consider the skilled freelancer. 10 years of experience. Top of his field. He works 60 hours a week. Bills by the hour. Earns well. Adds diligently. Now consider the mediocre agency owner. Average skills. But he owns the contract. He owns the client relationship. The freelancer works for him. The agency owner takes 30% for holding the gate. Same industry, same hours. The freelancer adds, the owner multiplies. The freelancer is more skilled, the owner is more wealthy. Skill plus effort multiplied by position. The position is everything. Here's what the Melians didn't understand, and the Medici did. You don't need capital to jump tiers. You need to control a bottleneck through strategic positioning. You don't need to own the resource. You need to own the gate. John D. Rockefeller didn't own all the oil. Standard Oil controlled the railroads that moved it. Every barrel extracted by every competitor had to pass through his infrastructure. He didn't need to drill. He needed to control the choke point where value was forced to flow. Bill Gates didn't build better computers. Microsoft controlled the operating system that ran on them. Every hardware manufacturer, every software developer, every user had to pass through his gate. The computers were commodities. The gate was the fortune. The Dutch East India Company understood this in 1602. They didn't just trade spices. They owned the ships that carried them. They owned the cannons that protected the ships. They owned the ports where the ships docked. They owned the maps that showed where the spices grew. They turned nutmeg, a commodity, into a sovereign state. At their peak, the Dutch East India Company had more military power than most nations. They waged wars, signed treaties, minted currency. They weren't merchants. They were an empire disguised as a holding company. The spice farmers worked. The Dutch East India Company collected. The pattern repeats throughout history. The one who owns the commodity works. The one who owns the gate collects. The House of Medici didn't have more money than the Catholic Church. They controlled access to capital when the church needed to fund its operations through regulatory arbitrage. The bottleneck was the mechanism, not the resource. Modern applications own the process, the relationship, the access point, not the commodity. The commodity producer is always at the mercy of the one who controls distribution through financial leverage. The freelancer is always at the mercy of the one who controls the client relationship. The employee is always at the mercy of the one who controls the payroll. Your position in the hierarchy determines the multiplier applied to everything you do. The same skill, the same effort produces radically different outcomes depending on whether you're an employee or an equity holder in the structure. Your morality tells you the first path is noble. Honest work for honest pay. Your morality is keeping you in the addition tier while others multiply past you through financial leverage. But here's where most people fail. They see the formula, they understand the math, and they still hesitate. They still wait. They still ask for permission. Why? Because you were trained to seek approval, not sovereignty. The psychological execution isn't the rule that keeps you poor, it's the reflex that makes you obey the rule without questioning who wrote it. Somewhere in your development you learned that safety meant compliance, that approval was oxygen, that conflict was danger, that being seen as good was more important than being effective. This programming served you as a child, it's killing you as an adult. Let me be direct with you. Your niceness isn't a virtue, it's a lack of options. A rabbit isn't virtuous for not eating a wolf. It's just a rabbit, it lacks the capacity. A wolf that chooses not to eat, that's virtue, because the choice exists. You tell yourself you're above the ruthless tactics, that you're better than that, but you've never had the option. You've never controlled a bottleneck, never held financial leverage, never had the power to take what you wanted. Your niceness is just weakness wearing a costume. The integrated man has the capacity for dominance. He chooses when to deploy it. The nice man has no capacity at all and calls his impotence morality. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this in The Prince. The prince who shows his throat, his fear, his anger, his need for approval is easy to kill. The one who remains unreadable survives. This is the black box strategy, the most important financial principle you were never taught. When you don't explain yourself, they can't predict you. When they can't predict you, they can't position against you. When they can't position against you, they fear you. Humans are biologically wired to fear what they cannot predict. This isn't philosophy, it's neuroscience. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, activates more intensely for uncertain threats than for known dangers. A visible enemy triggers preparation. An invisible enemy triggers paralysis. Hostility is predictable. You know what an angry person will do. The unreadable person creates uncertainty. You don't know their next move. You can't prepare. That uncertainty becomes restraint. This is why predictability is the precursor to domestication. Think about it. How do you tame an animal? You make its behavior predictable. You learn its patterns. You anticipate its needs. You remove its capacity to surprise you. Once you can predict it, you can control it. You have been domesticated by your own transparency. Every time you explain your reasoning, you teach them how to manipulate you. Every time you reveal your values, you show them where to apply pressure. Every time you announce your boundaries, you draw them a map of your cage. This is strategic silence. The moment you explain your why, you have surrendered your power. An equity holder doesn't explain. He simply exists as a fact that others must deal with. The Athenians didn't explain why they wanted Melos. They didn't justify their demands. They simply stated, submit or die. The Melians could take it or leave it. There was no negotiation because there was nothing to negotiate with. Being readable is the ultimate financial sin. Your morality makes you readable. It broadcasts your constraints. It announces your limits. Your morality is a tell. It signals exactly where your boundaries are. And boundaries, once known, are exploited. When you announce, "I would never do that," you've told everyone exactly how to position themselves against you. When you display your ethical limits, you've handed your opponents a map of your vulnerabilities. When you perform your virtue publicly, you've revealed that you need to be seen as good more than you need to win. Need is weakness. Visible need is suicide. The House of Medici understood this. Public virtue, private reality. In public they were pious, funded churches, commissioned religious art, supported the theology that condemned the very practices making them rich. In private, they were ruthless, manipulating exchange rates through double-entry bookkeeping, purchasing papal influence, designing systems that extracted wealth while wearing the costume of Christian virtue. The Athenians understood this differently. They didn't bother with the costume. They told the Melians directly, "Kolsi, power is the only reality, and your morality is irrelevant to the outcome." Both survived because they integrated the capacity for danger. You don't need to be cruel. You need to be capable of cruelty so that you are never forced to be weak. This is the shadow work that separates the equity holder from the employee. The nice person can't hold power because they're terrified of being seen as dangerous. They need the world to validate their goodness. That need is the leak that drains every advantage. The integrated person acknowledges the part of themselves that wants to dominate. That could be ruthless. That has the capacity for strategic harm. They don't act on it randomly. They channel it into structure. The House of Medici didn't rage against the Catholic Church. They restructured their rage into a banking system that extracted wealth from the very institution condemning their methods. The difference between the monster and the sovereign isn't the presence of darkness. It's the architecture that channels it. You've been taught that acknowledging your capacity for dominance makes you a bad person. The opposite is true. Denying it makes you a controllable person. The shadow you refuse to see is the shadow that controls you. Consider the Melians one last time. They were good people, neutral, peaceful, fair. They believed their innocence would protect them. Their goodness was the vulnerability the Athenians exploited. Their morality was the tell that revealed they would never strike first, never escalate, never do what was necessary to survive. The Athenians didn't fear them. You can't fear someone who has announced they'll never hurt you. This isn't about becoming a monster. It's about refusing to be prey. It's about becoming dangerous enough that predators select easier targets. The House of Medici didn't build a bank. They built a fortress that generated wealth for generations after the founders were dust. The architecture outlived the architect. This is the blueprint for sovereignty. Structure outlives trends. Control outlives ownership. Step 1. Audit your position. Ask the brutal question. Does your wealth depend on your presence? If you stopped working tomorrow, would income continue to flow? If you were in a coma for 6 months, would your bank account grow or drain? If the answer is drain, you are still an employee. You've built nothing. You've only rented your time to someone else's structure. Your career is a costume for wage labor. Your success is measured in how much you're allowed to keep of what you produce for someone else. The first task is honest assessment. Most people skip this step. The answer is uncomfortable. They prefer the illusion of progress to the reality of their position. They count their salary increases without calculating how much of their life force they're trading for numbers that inflate away. Ask yourself, am I building an asset, or am I the asset being depleted? Step 2. Identify the bottleneck through regulatory arbitrage opportunities. In every industry, value is forced to flow through choke points. The distributor sits between the producer and the market. The platform sits between the creator and the audience. The broker sits between the buyer and the seller. Find the choke point in your domain. You don't need capital to insert yourself. You need relationships, expertise, or access that others lack. The House of Medici didn't have more gold than the Catholic Church. They had better architecture for moving it through regulatory arbitrage. Step 3. Build multiple holding company structures. One income stream is survival. Multiple streams are sovereignty. The House of Medici maintained branches across Europe. Florence, Rome, Venice, London, Bruges. When one market contracted, others expanded. When one monarch defaulted on loans, other relationships sustained them. They built redundancy into their holding company structure. Your single job, your single client, your single source of income. This is fragility disguised as stability. One decision by one person can destroy everything you've built. Step 4. Deploy financial leverage into appreciating assets. Money sitting idle is money being eaten by inflation. Every dollar that isn't deployed is a soldier deserting your army. The House of Medici understood this. They deployed capital constantly through double-entry bookkeeping, converting cash into positions that generated returns. Real estate that produces rent whether you're awake or asleep. Equity that compounds whether you're working or traveling. businesses that operate without your daily presence, generating value from systems rather than sweat. These are the fortresses that work while you sleep. They don't require your presence to function. They don't deplete when you rest. They are the architecture of sovereignty. The Medici lesson: silent empires. Own nothing visibly, control everything structurally. The visible wealthy are targets for taxation, for regulation, for resentment. The invisible wealthy are untouchable. They control without appearing to possess. The bank itself eventually collapsed in 1494. Overextension. Bad loans to monarchs who couldn't pay. Political conspiracy. But the lesson endured. The family that controlled access to capital shaped the Renaissance. The pawnbrokers who charged interest openly are footnotes. The House of Medici are history. The Athenian lesson: hesitation is death. When you see the vacuum, you move. The Melians waited for Sparta to save them. Sparta never came. The Athenians didn't wait for permission to take the island. They saw the opportunity, and they acted. When you see the bottleneck, when you identify the choke point, when the regulatory arbitrage opportunity appears, you move. You don't ask if it's fair. You don't wait for consensus. You don't check if everyone approves. You act. The Melians waited for permission. They consulted their morality. They hoped for rescue. They believed that doing nothing wrong would protect them from having wrong done to them. They were wrong, and they're dead. The alternative is waiting for someone else to seize what you saw first, and then wondering why you're still an employee instead of an equity holder. You were not born to be an employee to a code designed to keep you predictable. The Melians believed in fairness. They're dust. The House of Medici believed in architecture. Their name echoes through 6 centuries. The Athenians believed in power. They built an empire. Your morality is the Melian inheritance. The belief that virtue protects, that fairness prevails, that if you just follow the rules hard enough, the universe will reward your compliance with equity holder status. It won't. The world doesn't reward virtue. It rewards financial leverage. It rewards those who understand the architecture of power and position themselves at the choke points where value must flow. You have the blueprint now. The question is whether you'll use it, or whether you'll keep waiting for permission from people who will never give it. Subscribe if you're ready to dismantle the lie.